Thank you, Senator Eva Burch, for being here. If you want to introduce yourself to the audience and let us know who you are and what you do, and tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. I am Eva Burch. I am the state senator from Legislative District 9 in Arizona. I represent mostly Mesa, which is a big city in the Phoenix metropolitan area. This is my first term. I'm a freshman elected official here in Arizona. But I came at a really good time for me in particular, just because of my background and because of my career outside of the legislature. I've been a nurse since 2012 and became a nurse practitioner in 2019. And I've been working primarily in the reproductive healthcare space as a nurse practitioner in a women's clinic, dealing with birth control, with infections, with wellness exams, endometriosis, PCOS, all of those types of chronic illnesses and wellness and health concerns that have become really important to me and a really important part of what I do for the community. I currently work in the opioid use disorder space and have been doing that for just over a year now. But I was able to bring some of that experience to the legislature with me as we have been grappling with a lot of really bad legislation as it relates to reproductive rights.
Yeah, I think anyone who watches my channel is probably familiar with what that alludes to. I'm interested personally in what would possess you to, if I'm understanding correctly, continue working clinically, do all of that schooling and work, and then also go into politics as what, like a little bit of a side gig?
Well, we are a working legislature. The Arizona legislature certainly doesn't pay enough to feed a family. Most of us have jobs. As far as working a full-time job, that is a little bit unusual in the legislature. But I think that what really got me interested was my time as an ER nurse. I was working in a big hospital in downtown Phoenix. And I really started to notice some of the disparities, especially as it relates to outcomes for individuals who come from different backgrounds, people who had didn't have as good of access to education, for example, or people who didn't have health insurance, most notably and most obviously, but people who had language barriers, people who had certain disabilities, certainly women, and people who had housing insecurity and food insecurity. I just saw so many things that impacted the quality of care and the outcomes that people would have. And I felt like it shouldn't be that way. I felt like there was more that I could do. So I went back to school and got on the other side of the orders and became an advanced practice provider. And I just have never felt like that's been enough either. I just know that there's more that I could do, that I wanted to have more influence and I wanted to bring some of these stories to the forefront. I feel like so much of what we do in the United States is profit driven and that we're not focused enough on my patients, on vulnerable populations, and on how much better outcomes could be if our system was more equitable and fair.
Yeah, having worked in both the US system, obviously, and done all of my training there, and now living and working in a system that is a universal healthcare system, it's really interesting. And I think a lot of what you're saying is honestly why I do what I do on the internet as well, is just there's so much more impact that needs to be had. And there's things about the US system I think that are really great. And then a lot of things that we just really don't get right. And it feels a little bit difficult to actually make any kind of impact. But you actually had a personal experience earlier this year, a pregnancy that unfortunately got a lot of attention, probably in a more negative aspect than I'm sure you would have liked when going through something really difficult. And as much as you're comfortable, if you want to share a little bit about what happened and I think it was kind of why we decided to have this conversation today. I'm love to share that with everybody as well.
Sure. I actually love talking about it. I think it's really important that individuals who are comfortable and who do feel like they can speak freely and feel safe in that conversation, that they do speak out. And I think that was why I made the decision that I made. But I've had a very hard time with fertility. I met my husband later in life. We were 38 by the time that we got married. And there was a lot of questions about whether or not we were going to try to have a child. I have two little boys. I have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old little boy from a previous relationship, but that was not a healthy relationship. And have never been married until I met my husband. And we really wanted to try. We really wanted to have a child together and have that experience of raising a child with someone who you love and care for. But we had tremendous difficulties. I have had 3 miscarriages in the last few years as we have tried to conceive. We were doing all the things that people do when they're trying to conceive. We were tracking my ovulation, and we were, just being very intentional in everything that we did to try to get pregnant. It took several months before we got pregnant for the first time, but all things considered, I was excited. I thought that we had done pretty well, that it hadn't taken a year and a half. It hadn't taken 2 years. We didn't have to go to a fertility clinic. We did get pregnant. And we're very excited about it. And we had gotten through about 9 months before we started telling people. And this was back in 2022, and just told some close family members. But it became pretty clear that that pregnancy was not progressing at a certain point, and had some ultrasounds, had some blood work done, and made the decision to terminate the pregnancy once we knew that it was not going to be able to continue safely and to term for me. So we made that decision, and I had a really rough experience with it when I had scheduled that termination, which it can be difficult in Arizona. It can be hard to get an appointment. Sometimes it can take a couple weeks or more before you can get in to see a provider. So the 24-hour wait period that is implemented here in Arizona isn't really 24 hours because there are so few providers who want to provide this type of care in such a hostile environment like Arizona is. So it got to a point where I was scheduled to go in the next day for my procedure, and I started to miscarry, and we didn't have the time that we needed. It didn't happen soon enough. I started to miscarry and was bleeding very heavily, and it's very difficult to make me nervous because I worked as an ER nurse for so long. But what I was seeing during that miscarriage made me nervous, and so I asked my husband to call an ambulance, and we went to the ER where I stopped bleeding altogether. And I thought that everything was done. I thought that I had miscarried and it was over. But we went back and I did an ultrasound, and the ultrasound tech looked at me and kind of shook his head and said that there was still an embryo in there, and he wasn't totally sure if there was still a heartbeat or not. After a little while longer, he said that he was pretty convinced that there wasn't any cardiac activity at that point. So I thought, well, that's great. At least now I can have a procedure and I can be done and I can get out of here and just get on with my life. But my doctor, who was wonderful and who said, yeah, let's get that going for you, came back, and the surgeon said no. Surgeon said he didn't want to do it. Wasn't something he was comfortable with for whatever reason. And I was told to go home and to see what happens next, or that they would give me some medication. They could give me some cytotec, and if I started bleeding again, then if I bled enough, then I could have a procedure. And all of those options were terrible to me. I was supposed to go home and see if I developed an infection, see if I ever completed this miscarriage, see if I started bleeding and it became dangerous enough for me to be worthy of a procedure. So we went to the abortion clinic the next day, where I got the care that I needed and where I was able to have a procedure to complete the miscarriage that really wasn't taking for me. And the whole experience was terrifying. It was awful. And so when 2 years later I became pregnant again, we were cautiously hopeful. The pregnancy looked a little better than it had previously at first, but more ultrasounds, more blood work, same story, definitely not progressing. And at this point in time, Arizona is now debating, and it's running through the courts, whether or not they're going to reinstate this Civil War era ban. And I knew that the timing was really important. So we were able to get in, we were able to have a procedure. And it was not even 3 weeks later that the Supreme Court of Arizona reinstated this ban from the 1800s that could have very easily done what happened in Arizona in 2022, where abortion clinics shut down all across the state of Arizona because nobody knew what the law was. And someone like me, who was in a precarious situation where travel wasn't even necessarily appropriate or safe for me with retained products of conception, would be forced to make an impossible decision about what to do next for their care. So since I had been through all of that, I felt as though it was critically important that I share that experience with others, and that people understand the reality of how the work that we do in the Arizona legislature impacts people in the real world. And so while I was still pregnant, I decided to make that speech on the floor of the Arizona Senate and make my business everybody's business. And I'm glad I did. I think that it brought attention to Arizona right before this very meaningful and impactful decision by the Arizona Supreme Court, it sort of opened the door for the conversation and allowed everybody to see it from what I believe to be the right perspective. So it was a good and unique opportunity for me, and I would do it all over again.
Yeah, it's such an important conversation to be had, and I agree. I think the right angle for this conversation is always from perspective of the patient. And I grew up in the Bible Belt in a very small town Texas rural religious community, and unlearning what we were told was true about those things as I progressed through my career was very difficult. And I will attribute every amount of learning and progress that I've made in my understanding of the legislation behind termination and access to abortion and how it affects people, not just seeking elective termination, but across the board for miscarriage care as well as lethal anomalies. I would attribute to the patients that allowed me to walk that journey with them and to hear what they go through and to help them navigate that. I don't know that people who don't have a firsthand account or haven't walked with others that they care about through that truly have an understanding of how horrible it is to add on top of somebody's worst day legislative loopholes and things that they have, hoops that they have to jump through to just get care. Is that so? Kind of, I was going to ask you kind of what compelled you to write the Rolling Stone piece, but I'm sure it was all of that you just said, the same thing that makes you passionate about talking about this in general. How do you think, my personal opinion is, I don't think most people who vote for these laws understand how they impact people, not just seeking elective termination, but people in truly life-threatening situations, people having miscarriages, people seeking reproductive health care in general for things like IVF. How do you hope to see this conversation progress as we, I hope, start to band together and roll back some of these just archaic laws that have been instated or reinstated over the past several years?
Well, I think that we have to really look at who's controlling the conversation first and foremost. Something that was really upsetting and unsettling to me when we were going through this process in the Arizona legislature of trying to repeal this law, that the overwhelming majority of people in Arizona said, this is terrible, this is horrifying, this is not what we want. But the people who are calling the shots are making it clear that this is what they want. There were a few individuals, a few of my Republican colleagues who, thank goodness, were willing to take a step back and to say, no, this isn't the right thing for Arizona. This isn't what we want. But by and large, we had individuals. We had Representative Parker, for example, over in the Arizona House, stood up and said, look, 2 years ago in 2022, when Roe was overturned, it was very clear to all of us that the intention was that this, and they called it the pre-Roe law, not the Civil War era law, not the 1800s law, none of the things that it really is, the territorial law, all of those things, but just referring to it in these really vanilla terms that are not really descriptive of what they're actually asking for people to do. Just said that it was always the intention of the majority party in the Arizona legislature to reinstate this law. We have to start really believing people when they say these things, because we have seen since the fall of Roe in state after state after state that these radicalized political leaders, these electeds who come in and say that they are going to be trying to reinstate the most just archaic and really confining, restrictive legislation that is not in line with what the majority of people want, regardless of political party. We have to understand that that is what they're going to do and more. They are throwing softballs. They are not even being as transparent as they should be about what their true intentions are. And I have heard time and time again these individuals saying that there is always going to be exception for people who are experiencing a miscarriage or for people who are having these life-threatening situations. But that's not what happens. That isn't what happens in reality. And that's not what the legislation does. That's not what the words on the paper do effectually in our communities. And we have to look at this and look at the reality of how these laws are going to be played out, because it's going to be the medical providers who have to make these decisions. And they're no good to anybody if they lose their license. They're no good to anybody if they get thrown in jail. They're no good to anybody if they can no longer practice. And they are going to err on the side of caution. And when we have this really sweeping, vague legislation that makes it clear that abortion is bad and that if you terminate a pregnancy, something bad is going to happen to you, then we are going to start seeing the loss of life from women who are experiencing these complications. It's already the path that we're going down in this country. So I think that we just have to take it so seriously when we have these individuals who are coming to the forefront, because unfortunately, it's very commonly people who are radicalized who seek office because this is what they want. This is what they're after. And in the state of Arizona, at least, we have a primary system that encourages radicalism, because you have to get through a primary in order to get to the general election. And the person who leans the heaviest into their far party politics is the person who's going to get past the primary. And so we end up with these highly radicalized individuals. And what's ironic is that that's not happening in the Democratic Party as much. You have to be more moderate to be able to win your primary. But amongst my Republican colleagues, at least in the state of Arizona, it's the exact opposite. It is the most radicalized individuals who get through these primaries. And so if we have any hope for the future of reproductive healthcare in this country, we have to look at our state level legislation, and we have to elect pro-choice candidates.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that it's probably the same across the board in every part of US politics, that radicalized candidates on the right are who are preferentially kind of gravitated towards. I mean, we can see that from top to bottom. I think you made a lot of really good points there, and I think it really highlights the importance of people who are within the medical field to get involved in politics and using their voice. It was really hard for me living in Texas to branch into politics on the internet, especially with a fairly big following, because it didn't always feel like a safe thing to do to talk about abortion and things like that when I was working in Texas. And so I know how hard that can be for people who are still working in medicine and who also have families and live in small communities. It is very difficult, but I do think you highlight the importance of using your voice for things like that.
There's absolute truth in that what's happening in policy impacts the decisions that people are making, that families are making as it relates to whether or not to continue their pregnancies. I will tell you that when I had my most recent abortion earlier this year, I had them put an IUD in at the same, I'm sorry, I had them put an IUD in at the same time because I don't want to try again. I don't feel like this is a hospitable environment for me to try to grow my family right now, not knowing whether or not I'm going to be able to get the care I need to be able to stay here for my amazing husband and my two beautiful, perfect children, given that I am very high risk. I have a history of multiple miscarriages, and I've had things go wrong already, and I'm 44 years old. So I'm very high risk, and I am not willing to continue to take that risk in a place where I don't know for sure that I can get the care I need, because these laws are always in such flux. And it terrifies me that the people of Arizona are going to think that because we have this ballot initiative on the ballot, that we're going to pass this ballot initiative and that's going to solve the problem here in Arizona. But what I think people need to understand is that when this ballot initiative passes, which it will, and when it's challenged, which it will be, it will go to the same Arizona Supreme Court that upheld a ban from the 1800s. And they will make a decision about what to do with this ballot initiative. So I just can't stress the importance of making sure that we have the right people in office from the top to the bottom of the ticket. We have to have pro-choice candidates being elected to our state legislatures and all across the board if we want to make sure that this is a safe environment for people to grow their families. And it just makes me So I'm equal parts encouraged and afraid for this election in November, because I do think that the ballot initiative will be successful. But I'm worried that people will think that that means we solved the problem and that everything's going to be okay now, and that abortion is going to be legal in Arizona and there's nothing anybody can do about it now because it's in our Constitution. That's not the case. If we don't have the right people in positions of power, in our judges and our elected legislature, then when these things are challenged and when they try to find workarounds and other ways to make it difficult to get an abortion in this state, you know that when I had my procedure earlier this year, that this poor doctor had to tell me that if I chose to continue my pregnancy, that the father would have to support me financially. First of all, I just want to say that that's the most sexist thing I've ever heard in my life, because I will
Hang
tell you that
on, what is this? Is this like some kind of things that they have to counsel you on legally?
Arizona legislature is required to provide counseling to patients that is absolutely factually inaccurate. And
We have the same in Texas, yeah.
yeah, and it very often does not apply to the individual situation. I mean, I pay child support. So if, for example, now this is an impossible scenario, but if my husband and I had a child and then we divorced, and he wanted to sue me for child support and have 50-50 custody, I would be the one paying child support. You know, it just assumes that men out earn women in every situation. That's not the case for many women. It is so sexist. It makes me sick. So not only is that false, it is false to say that a man will have to financially support me. They also said that that if I so choose, I could choose parenting or adoption instead of abortion. That me, with my very wanted pregnancy that was doomed to miscarriage, that what I should do is really go home and think about it for 24 hours, because maybe I could just adopt the baby out. You know, I mean, it's ridiculous what they have to say to patients in Arizona. And this is the sort of thing that will continue happening, even if we are successful in all of the challenges and we do enshrine abortion rights into the Arizona Constitution. That doesn't mean that they are out of ideas. They are full of ideas, full of terrible ideas about how to make it difficult to get an abortion, how to sow seeds of doubt in the patient-provider relationship, and how to gum it up with red tape so that it's gone too far and you couldn't get in to see a provider. Make it difficult for providers to practice. Make it so that there just isn't anybody available or anybody willing to perform those types of procedures in Arizona. You know, that's what they're going to go to next. Well, since we couldn't win this battle, since the people didn't want this, and since the people of Arizona wanted access to abortion, how is it that we're now going to get what we want in spite of that? That is what is happening in Arizona and across the United States, that legislatures no longer care about the will of the people when it comes to these issues that they've decided to dig their heels in on. And so that is the future that I fear, and that is why I hope that that people will become involved and engaged in the political process, that they will vote, that they will research their candidates and make sure that they are voting for pro-choice candidates up and down the ticket, from state level races to judges to the presidency.
And I think it goes so well with the conversations that I have on my channel, which is, you know, how close to death does someone need to be the exception for life of the mother that they include in these? So that's often the argument. There are exceptions. There are exceptions. Okay, well, I work clinically. This is my job. I take care of these patients, and I don't know where that line is. But what I do know is that when you start drawing that line and we can't figure out where it is, we have to wait until we know that we aren't going to be put in jail for taking care of our patients. And that creates a situation where, sure, sometimes it might work out fine. Most of the time we get lucky, but sometimes it's not. And when that person that it doesn't work out fine, when you have to wait for someone to be septic or so near death that they are needing blood transfusions before you can intervene, those people, when they are someone you care about, are who fall victim to these laws. And I also really want to draw attention to the fact that we can put all the exceptions for non-viability and life threat and all of these things into these laws. And there's already the issue with that, as we've discussed. But leaving out people who don't fall into those categories, but have very valid reasons for needing to have a termination, whether it be severe mental health issues, there are other children who are high needs that are going to go uncared for because of a high risk pregnancy where someone ends up hospitalized for 23 weeks. It is not, this is not ever a black and white issue. It is not something that can be put on paper safely. And that is why it's so important to support this legislation and access to termination across the board. We need to trust pregnant people to make the decisions for themselves with their doctors that is best for them and best for their health.
No, I absolutely agree. And especially now working in the opioid use disorder space, where I have patients who are addicted to opioids, patients who are homeless, patients who are sex workers, patients who are in very vulnerable, precarious situations, people who have coercive or abusive partners. You know, there is never going to be a time where I think that I am better suited to make that decision for another individual. I do think the role of the provider is important. I think it's really important that we're making sure that patients are well informed, that they know what their options are, and that we're not being coercive in any way for these patients. And I never once in an abortion clinic as a patient felt like somebody was trying to convince me I should have an abortion. But I certainly have felt strongly by legislators in Arizona and by my poor doctor who had to say all those ridiculous things. It's fine for me. I'm educated on these subjects in particular, and I know what's happening to me. But to somebody who doesn't, it's confusing. It's upsetting. And we have to know that our providers are the ones who are qualified to counsel patients. Our providers are the ones who are qualified to help a patient determine what the best course is for them. It is the individual, it's the patient themselves, their provider, and whoever they choose to include in that conversation who need to be making these decisions. And the politicians in this country need to divorce themselves from the conversation. And that is what the majority of Americans want.
Like, to be perfectly frank, the number of people that I have had sit in my office who had that very same, very deep-seated belief until it was them that was in need of that is countless. Because working in Texas, that's nearly everybody in small town Texas. And guess what? They still need access to termination, and you don't know until you are there. And I cannot reiterate enough how important it is because of that to take politics out of this conversation and let people make decisions that are best for them.
Yeah, of course. And you know, again, most people, regardless of party, feel that way. It's whether or not we're going to be able to elevate that issue as being important enough to move the needle in November. We have a competing ballot initiative. It's interesting because the Republicans freaked out when this ban went up and we had to make a vote now, and now they're on a very unpopular side of this issue. And there was talk about them doing a competing ballot initiative for a less restrictive ban. And I thought to myself, there's no way they're not going to be able to all agree on this, because there's too many of them who are like, no abortions under any circumstances. There was no way they were going to get all of them, which is what they would need. We're a 1-seat minority in both the House and the Senate. We are 16-14 in the Senate, and we are 29-31 in the House. So in our state legislature. So there was no way they were going to get every single member on board to say that a 20-week ban or a 15-week ban or an 8-week ban or 6-week ban, anything. There were too many of them who say no ban is good enough, but a total ban. That's the only ban that's good enough. That's the ban we want. So I wasn't worried about that. But what they have done instead is to put a border security ballot initiative on that allows police officers to assume the role of border agents and federal officers to be able to arrest people who they suspect of illegal border crossing. Horrible idea, ridiculous, and it's going to bring a lot of people to the polls. So I mean, it's genius. That's what they decided to do to compete with what they knew was going to be a slew of people going to vote for this abortion initiative. I do think what we have on our side is that our initiative is a citizens initiative. We had people pounding the pavement, knocking doors, standing in parking lots, gathering signatures, hundreds of thousands of them. This initiative is something that they put together last minute that they just got past the legislature in a simple majority. They are able to put whatever they want on the ballot using their simple majority, and it bypasses the governor. So they have, I don't even know how many atrocious ballot initiatives that they are throwing on. So I think that our messaging really just has to be vote yes on the citizens initiative and no on everything else is probably going to have to come down to for us to be able to try to protect this. But it's a smart move for them to do that, because that is an issue that people are very, very concerned about. But you know, we had a really good piece of federal border legislation that the Trump Republicans killed. So, you know, there's no accountability for that. So we'll just send our cops instead to do the job of our federal officers. It's crazy town over here in Arizona right now.
I mean, and I obviously don't live in Texas at the moment, but it is very similar to Texas politics. And I think it's mind-blowing. And I think people who don't care about politics don't really understand how they get these ballot measures on that lead to things that maybe people don't want voted in, getting voted in, because they don't understand how things are kind of sticky sided to the back of things that they're voting for. And I think that's a really important point. I will say, I do feel like we've always known that things like overturning Roe v. Wade were not what the majority wanted. That's never been what the majority in the US wanted. And even when it happened, it wasn't what the majority wanted. That has never been the majority popular opinion. But I do think that in maybe the past year and a half, there has been a bit of a shift in how loud the public is about the fact that they don't support these really archaic total bans and 6-week, 8-week bans, things like that, which is not enough to change the legislation, obviously, because just as you were saying earlier, the radical people are who get elected a lot of times thanks to the way that our primaries work. But I do think there has been a much louder voice, even for people who lean right, for the public to now be comfortable saying, we don't want these really stringent bans. How that translates into actual legislation, I'm not sure that I feel real confident in that, but at least there has been a feeling to me of a shift there.
I think that that's true. I think that one of our biggest challenges by far is just messaging, because the Republicans are so much better at messaging than we are. They'll put some terrible ballot initiative on that really hurts public schools, and they'll call it the Parents' Bill of Rights or something like that. You know, they come up with these really quippy titles for things, and they message things in such a way like, you should have the right to make decisions about your child in school, and that has nothing to do with what's in the bill. You know, they come up with this nonsense that's easy to digest, and then what we have to do is try to explain to people one at a time what's really happening. And we expect people to be interested in the truth, but people are interested in what's easy to digest. They don't want to have to think it through. They don't want to have to think about the practical application of this legislation on, you know, it's difficult. And we have to be better at messaging in a way that is relatable to people and that is going to help us get things done. Because I always demand that my Republican colleagues operate in reality, but we have to operate in reality as well, especially as it relates to messaging and campaigning, and how we get people to understand that that what we're doing here is in everyone's best interest, and is probably really more aligned with their values than who they end up voting for. So I hope
absolutely. Yeah, it's a lot similar, actually. Sorry to interrupt you, but there is so much overlap with what you just said and what we do on the internet. And I have the same, obviously in a different part of the world or piece of existence in my brain, of when doctors are talking to patients, or nurses or nurse practitioners or whoever is talking to patients, and how you give them information. And yeah, I would argue, like, people don't it's not always that they don't want to think through things. It's people are busy. They're working 3 jobs to make ends meet and, barely paying for daycare in the process of that. We have to be able to give information to people in ways that they can understand it without having to put in extra work, because that's our job as doctors, to relay that information. And I would argue that as politicians, that's the job of a politician, is to put this into a digestible format for their constituents to be able to make decisions. Of course, it would be best if we could just live in a world where everybody could just dive into to legislation and understand it, and how does this apply, and what are we doing with it, and what do I actually want? But that's not reality. And you're right. I think that what I do online is quite similar. I take people who spread misinformation and I go, that tactic is working. How can I do that in a way that it is evidence-based and science-based and truth-based? And that's what I think the left-leaning people in politics have to do as well. Oh, look at Donald Trump up there. He is insufferable, but something he's doing is working. How can I take that and translate it into what I think is legislation that is good for people, and
Right.
how does it support them and benefit them?
And I'm really glad that we have more people who are interested, younger people. I mean, I'm in the world of politics, I'm quite young, and I think it is important that we have people who are that are raising families, that are actually actively involved and really being the subjects of the consequences of this legislation. And so I hope that that continues to play out. I do want to tell you that when that story went viral, because we knew it was going to get media attention, but we thought it was going to get local media attention. We were not anticipating the response that we got at all. But we had every major news network in the country reaching out and requesting interviews. And I just want you to know that the only one I cared about was Mama Dr. Jones. That's what I told them. I said, I just want you guys to get me on Mama Dr. Jones. And nobody cared, and they wouldn't do it for me. So I'm glad that I was able to reach out and get you. It's like, that's the only one I want. Can't you just try that for that one? They're like, no, Eva, we need to go on these big news shows. I'm like, okay. But
thank you. That means a lot to me. And I genuinely, that means so much to me. And I was really happy that we were able to connect as well. And I do really appreciate you being here and sharing your story.
It's such a pleasure to be able to meet you and talk with you. I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing and for making things so digestible. I think that that's why people love you so much. It's why I love you so much. So thank you so much for helping. I absolutely stole language from you in that speech, just trying to say, okay, how do I make this relatable, and how do I make this what people will understand and want to hear? And a lot of it was just because I watched so many Mama Dr. Jones videos that I felt like I could do it. So thank you for making me feel brave and strong and like I could do it.
Oh, you're gonna make me cry. Oh my God. Having been away and coming back, and this being one of the first things that I've done since I was back, I don't think you quite know how much that means to me. So thank you for saying that, and thank you for sharing your story and being here with us.
No, you're welcome. I don't think that I would be brave if I didn't see other people being brave. So it's it matters.
Well, best of luck on your journey and with your re-election and all the things that you're doing, and reach out, keep me updated if you have anything that you need and we can help with it. Please let us know.
Okay, thanks so much. Take good care of yourself.